The first spark caught in the hay packed around the third powder keg before I even smelled the smoke, and by the time I did smell it, I was already 40 feet out onto the Cinder Falls trestle bridge with 6 kegs of blasting powder behind my seat and 300 feet of empty air under the planking below me. I felt the team catch the fear before I saw the flame myself, both horses breaking stride at once, ears pinned flat, hooves suddenly loud and uneven against the planking in a way that told me everything I needed to know before I turned my head. The whole wagon lurched sideways hard enough that I had to throw my full weight into the reins just to keep us centered on planks that were, at their absolute widest, 11 inches wider than the wagon's own wheelbase, with nothing beyond that 11 inches but a low rail and 300 feet of clear mountain air down to the river rocks below. Behind me, past the driver's bench, past the tarp I'd lashed down myself that morning at the mine office with my own 2 hands, orange light was climbing the canvas in a way that canvas does not climb on its own. I did not look back a second time. Looking back would not put the fire out, and it would cost me a half-second of control over a team that badly needed every ounce of control I had left to give them. Fire, I heard someone screaming from the near end of the bridge, the Cinder Falls side, where a knot of townsfolk had gathered for the ordinary spectacle of watching the Tuesday powder wagon cross, the way they always did, because a wagon loaded with 600 pounds of blasting powder crossing a 300-foot gorge on nothing but Doug fir planking was, in a mining town, considered reasonably good entertainment. It was considerably less entertaining now. "Get off the bridge," someone else shouted, which was advice I did not need and could not have followed even if I had, because a wagon cannot simply reverse direction at a gallop on a bridge 11 feet wide, and unhitching a panicked team mid-span while burning powder sat 40 feet behind me was the kind of idea that got people killed faster than the firewood. From the far end, the Miners' Gulch side, I saw Western Cade come off the trestle scaffolding at a dead run, dropping a coil of cable he'd been securing not 30 seconds before. And I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives in the worst moments of a person's life, that he had already worked out what I had not yet had time to work out myself, which was that a wagon fire on a wooden bridge over dry gorge air was not a problem that solved itself by driving faster and hoping. "Cut the tarp lines," he was shouting, running flat out down the trestle toward me with nothing in his hands but a hunting knife he'd pulled from his belt on the move. "Cut the lines and roll the burning keg clear before it reaches the others." I had a hand free for exactly as long as it took to grab the reins single-handed and reach back with the other, and I used it to saw through the first tarp rope with a knife I kept strapped to my own boot for exactly this kind of occasion, because a woman who hauled freight for a living learned early that the day she needed a knife and didn't have one was the last mistake she'd ever make twice. The tarp fell back. The third keg, closest to the fire, had a black scorch mark climbing its staved side and a wisp of smoke curling up from where the burlap packing had caught. I got both hands back on the reins for 3 seconds, enough to straighten the team through a bad lurch toward the rail, and then Weston was there, at the wagon's tailgate, having covered 30 yards of narrow trestle at a dead sprint while I was fighting horses, and he had the burning keg in both arms before I'd fully processed that he'd reached me at all. "Don't stop the wagon," he shouted up at me, heaving the keg over the low tailgate and letting it drop the full 300 feet into the gorge below, where it would do nothing worse than scare the fish. "Keep them moving. Fire needs air to climb, and a moving wagon starves it faster than we can smother it by hand."
The trust is almost done.
I did not ask him how he knew that. I found out considerably later that he had spent 4 years building bridges for a railroad that lost 2 of them to exactly this kind of fire and had never once forgotten the lesson.
Hold!
We came off the Miners' Gulch end of the bridge together, my team blown and lathered.
We made
Western Cade running alongside the wagon's front wheel with one hand on the brace to keep his own footing. And the moment the back wheels cleared solid ground, I hauled the team to a stop and sat there shaking for considerably longer than I would ever admit to anyone in Cinder Falls, while Western Cade stood in the road catching his own breath and looking at me with an expression I did not have time in that particular moment to interpret. That was, by any reasonable accounting, the second time Western Cade saved something on that bridge that mattered to me, and it would not be the last. I was 27 years old that September of 1887, and I had been hauling freight across the Colorado high country for 6 years, since my father's leg gave out under a wagon wheel in a Durango yard and left the Sorensen Freight Company with exactly one Sorensen still capable of driving a team. My mother had wanted me to sell the wagons and the contract and take a position teaching school in Denver, which was, she pointed out reasonably, a job that did not involve 600 pounds of blasting powder on a bridge 11 feet wide. I had told her I would consider it. I had been telling her that for 6 years. The Cinder Falls mine paid Sorensen Freight $40 a run for the powder contract alone, considerably more than the general freight paid, on account of the particular risk involved, at a time when most freight runs in the territory brought $15 to $20 regardless of what sat in the wagon bed. Blasting powder itself ran 11 cents a pound wholesale out of Denver that year, which meant 600 pounds behind my driver's seat represented $66 of mine capital, and considerably more than that in the ore it would eventually blast free, a fact the mine's superintendent reminded me of every single Tuesday, as though I might otherwise forget what I was hauling. I had never once in those 6 years lost a keg, a horse, or a customer's confidence, which was a fact I was, without apology, proud of. The town had opinions about a woman driving the powder wagon, the way towns in the territory always had opinions about women doing work the town had decided belonged to men, and Cinder Falls' opinions had mostly settled by 1887 into a grudging, unspoken respect built entirely on 6 years of watching me do the job correctly. Western Cade had arrived that spring from the railroad's Denver office to oversee the trestle bridge's repair and reinforcement, a job that put him, functionally, in daily proximity to every wagon that crossed his bridge, including mine, and it had taken him considerably less time than the rest of the town to form his own opinion, which was, in his own words, the first week he'd known me, that I drove that bridge like I owned the gorge underneath it. I had told him that was, on the whole, an accurate way to describe how a person ought to drive a bridge. He had not argued the point. He was 29 years old, dark auburn hair that caught copper in direct sun, hazel green eyes that missed very little about the structural integrity of anything he looked at, powerfully built through the shoulders from 4 years of bridge work in weather that did not care whether a man felt like laboring that particular day. I had noticed all of this the way a person notices weather, which is to say, I had noticed it considerably more than the weather actually warranted, and had spent a good part of the summer telling myself it changed nothing about the fact that I had a powder contract to run and no particular use for a railroad engineer's opinion of my driving, however correct that opinion happened to be. Garrett Voss owned the Miners Gulch claim on the far side of the gorge, and had wanted the Cinder Falls trestle bridge gone since the spring survey confirmed what he had suspected for 2 years, which was that the richest vein in the district ran directly beneath the bridge's own foundation pilings, unreachable and untouchable so long as the bridge stood, and the mine kept paying its lease on the crossing rights. Voss was not, by nature, a patient man, but he had learned patience the way ambitious men learn most things, by calculating that the alternative cost more than he was willing to pay. If the bridge burned in what looked like an accident, the town lost its only crossing to the rail line and the outside markets. The mine's ore stopped moving. The lease on the crossing rights lapsed within 90 days under its own written terms, and Garrett Voss would own, free and clear, the single richest vein of silver in 3 counties. He had paid a disgruntled former Sorensen teamster $200 to pack a slow-burning fuse into the hay bedding of the Tuesday powder run, time to catch somewhere past the bridge's midpoint where the fire would have the longest possible distance left to climb before any driver could reach solid ground in either direction. Before we go further, I want to know where you're listening from today, because it means considerably more than you'd think to know this reaches you wherever you are. Now let's get back to it, because Weston Cade is about to ask Kit Sorensen a question he'd been working up the nerve to ask since the spring thaw. There had been an evening in July, 3 weeks before the fire, when Weston had walked out to the Sorensen yard after his shift on the bridge and found me checking harness leather by lantern light, and had stood at the fence a good while longer than the errand he'd invented required, turning his hat in his hands the particular way men do when they've arrived at the edge of a sentence and lost their nerve about finishing it. "I've been meaning to ask you," he'd started, and then one of my horses had chosen that exact moment to kick a loose board in its stall loud enough to startle us both, and by the time the noise settled, he had simply asked whether I thought the north approach needed regrading before winter, which was not, I understood even then, the question he had actually intended to ask. The fire that nearly took the bridge was not an accident, though it took the county investigator the better part of a week to establish that, working backward from the burnt fuse remnant Weston found wedged in the wagon's undercarriage the morning after, a detail no ordinary spark from a wheel bearing could have produced. Sheriff Pruitt rode out to the Miners' Gulch claim with that evidence 3 days later and found Garrett Voss's hired teamster already halfway to Cheyenne with $200 he could not adequately explain, and the whole scheme unraveled from there with the particular speed that schemes unravel once one frightened, overpaid man starts talking to save his own neck. Weston came to the Sorensen yard the evening after the arrest, not with any errand invented this time, and found me exactly where he'd found me in July, checking harness leather by lantern light, and this time he did not lose his nerve when a horse kicked its stallboard because I had, in the intervening weeks, quietly moved that particular horse to a stall considerably farther from the fence. "I've been meaning to ask you something for a while now," he said, and I set down the harness and told him I was aware, and had been aware since July, and had moved a horse specifically to give him a fair chance at finishing the sentence this time. He laughed, the real kind, and asked whether I would let him build something with me that wasn't made of railroad timber. I told him that depended entirely on what he had in mind. He said a house on the Cinder Falls side of the gorge, close enough to the bridge that I could still see my wagon crossing it every Tuesday morning for the rest of my life, if I wanted that. I told him I supposed I did want that, provided he understood the powder contract was not negotiable, not for him, not for anyone, and that I had watched 2 other women in this territory trade a trade they loved for a husband's comfort, and had decided a long time ago it would not happen to me the same way. He was quiet a moment, considering that the way he considered load-bearing calculations thoroughly and without hurry. "I'm not asking you to stop being the best teamster in 3 counties, he said finally. "I'm asking to be standing at the end of the bridge when you cross it. Those aren't the same request." I told him they were not, and that I had noticed the difference, and that the difference was, as it happened, the entire reason I was still standing at this fence talking to him instead of having sent him home an hour ago. He said he had never once considered asking me to give it up, and that the day he tried would be the day he'd finally understood nothing at all about who he was asking to marry him. I looked at him a long moment in the lantern light, this careful, thorough man who built things meant to hold weight for 50 years, and clearly intended to apply the same standard to whatever we built together, and told him that was, without question, the correct answer and the only one I would have accepted. We were married the following March on the Cinder Falls side of the Trestle Bridge itself, with half the town in attendance and Garrett Voss serving the first of an 8-year sentence in the territorial prison at Canyon City, and Sheriff Pruitt gave a short, dry toast at the gathering afterward, observing that it was, in his professional opinion, the only wedding he'd ever attended that had technically been made possible by a felony arson charge. Weston built the house exactly where he'd promised, close enough to the gorge that on quiet mornings I could hear the bridge's timbers settling and shifting the way old wood does, a sound I had once found ordinary and now found, for reasons I did not examine too closely, considerably more precious than I would have predicted 6 years into a freight contract. that had nearly killed me twice. The bridge itself was reinforced that winter with new steel truss supports Weston had been requesting from the railroad since April, funded in part by the insurance settlement on Voss's arson, a fact the town found considerably satisfying to repeat at every opportunity for the better part of a year. I still drive the Tuesday powder run. Weston inspects that bridge himself every Monday evening now, timber by timber, bolt by bolt, a habit he will not break for any reason short of the bridge itself finally coming down, and I have stopped pretending I don't know exactly why he does it, or exactly what it means that he stands at the near end every Tuesday morning to watch me cross, whether or not the schedule requires him to be there. My father used to say a good teamster earns her reputation the day something goes wrong, not the day everything goes right. I understood, that September on the burning bridge, exactly how right he had been, and I understood something else besides which he never lived to see, which was that the reputation a person earns in their worst moment sometimes turns out to be the exact thing that brings the right person running toward the fire instead of away from it. Some nights, sitting on the porch of the house Weston built close enough to hear the bridge breathe, I think about the third keg going over the tailgate into 300 feet of empty gorge air, and about a man who ran 30 yards of burning trestle toward a stranger's wagon because it was the right thing to do before he had any particular reason to know it was also, eventually, going to be his own life he was running toward. He never did get around to asking whether I minded that he'd made that decision without consulting me first. I never got around to telling him I would have been considerably more troubled if he hadn't.